The promise of joy has a way of disguising the approach of disaster, and on that afternoon, as light poured softly through the tall windows and settled across polished floors and carefully arranged flowers, everything about Daphne and Carter's gathering seemed touched by a fragile kind of perfection. It was not extravagant, not overwhelming in scale, but it carried an intimacy that made it feel more significant than any grand announcement ever could. This was not just a celebration. It was a moment they believed would redefine their future, a turning point where uncertainty would give way to clarity, where love would anchor itself in something tangible and undeniable. Daphne moved through the room with a quiet glow, her hand resting unconsciously against her abdomen, her expression softened by a happiness that felt almost sacred. Carter, standing close to her, watched her with a tenderness that had grown stronger with every passing day, as though he had finally found a version of life that made sense, a path that no longer required compromise or doubt. For Carter, this moment represented resolution. He had lived too long in the shadow of complicated loyalties, of choices that seemed right until they fractured under pressure, of relationships that demanded more than they could sustain. With Daphne, things had felt different, simpler, not because they lacked depth, but because they lacked the constant undercurrent of conflict that had defined so much of his past. The idea of a child, of a shared future rooted in something as fundamental as life itself, felt like confirmation that he had finally chosen correctly. He allowed himself, perhaps for the first time in a long while, to believe fully in what stood before him. Daphne believed it too. But belief, as she was about to learn, does not alter truth. It only delays its arrival. Across town, the shift had already begun. The envelope had arrived without warning, its presence so ordinary that it might have been dismissed entirely if not for the way it had been delivered. No return address, no indication of origin, only a name written with deliberate clarity. Steffi had recognized immediately that it was not something meant to be ignored. There was a weight to it, not physical, but intuitive, a sense that whatever it contained would not leave her unchanged. She had opened it alone, without preparation, without anticipation of the magnitude of what she was about to see. The contents had not been complicated. A set of documents, clinical, precise, impossible to misinterpret, DNA results. At first, her mind had resisted the conclusion, searching for error, for inconsistency, for any reason to question the validity of what lay before her. But the data was clear, the conclusions unmistakable. The child Daphne carried was not Carter's. It was Deacon's. The name alone had sent a shock through her system, not because of its unfamiliarity, but because of everything it represented. Deacon had already been a destabilizing force in too many lives, his presence tied to complications, to emotional entanglements that rarely resolved cleanly. And now, his connection extended further, deeper, into something that could not be undone or ignored. Steffi did not hesitate long. Some truths demand time, reflection, careful consideration. This was not one of them. This was a truth that, once known, required action, not because of impulsiveness, but because delay would only allow it to grow more destructive. She knew where Daphne and Carter would be. She knew what they intended to announce. And she understood, with a clarity that bordered on inevitability, that allowing them to proceed without intervention would mean building their future on a foundation that would inevitably collapse. So she went. Back at the gathering, the moment had arrived. There is a particular kind of silence that precedes important announcements, a collective pause where anticipation gathers and focuses, where every conversation fades just enough to allow something new to emerge. Carter stepped forward, his hand finding Daphne's, his expression steady despite the emotion beneath it. He began to speak, his voice carrying warmth, certainty, the quiet confidence of someone who believed he was about to share something that would bring nothing but happiness. And then the doors opened. The interruption was not loud, not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was defined by contrast, the stillness of the room against the deliberate sound of footsteps, the controlled composure of the gathering against the unyielding presence of someone who had not come to celebrate. Steffi did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply entered, her gaze fixed, her posture unwavering, the envelope in her hand more powerful than any declaration that had been planned. The shift in the room was immediate. Carter's expression faltered first, confusion replacing certainty as he took in her presence, the timing of her arrival, the absence of any explanation. Daphne felt it next, a subtle tightening in her chest, a flicker of unease that she could not yet define but could not ignore. The air itself seemed to change, the warmth draining away, replaced by something colder, sharper, more precise. Steffi stopped just a few steps away. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with implication, with the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. When she finally did speak, her voice was steady, controlled, but beneath it was an intensity that could not be mistaken. She did not ask questions. She presented facts. The documents left her hand and moved into Carter's, the physical transfer of something that would alter everything he believed to be true. He looked down, his eyes scanning the pages, his mind struggling to keep pace with what he was reading. At first, there was disbelief, a natural, instinctive rejection of information that did not align with expectation. But disbelief cannot survive clarity for long. The conclusion was unavoidable. The child was not his. The words that followed did not feel like speech. They felt like impact, like the moment something breaks, not because it was weak, but because the force applied to it is too great to withstand. Steffi said it plainly, without embellishment, without hesitation. The child belonged to Deacon. The reaction was not immediate. Carter stood still, the papers trembling slightly in his hands, his thoughts collapsing inward as he tried to reconcile the reality in front of him with the life he had imagined just moments before. It was not just shock, it was disorientation, the sudden realization that the narrative he had built, the trust he had placed, had been constructed on something that was no longer true. When he finally looked up, his gaze found Daphne's, searching for something, an explanation, a denial, anything that might restore even a fragment of what had just been lost. Daphne shook her head, her own disbelief overwhelming, her voice rising in fragmented attempts to reject what had been revealed. She insisted it was wrong, that there must have been a mistake, that the test could not be accurate. But even as she spoke, there was a fracture in her certainty, a hesitation that betrayed the possibility she was trying so desperately to deny. Carter saw it, and that was enough. The question came slowly, painfully, pulled from a place that had already begun to unravel. He did not need to phrase it fully. The implication was clear. The night in question, the moment that now stood at the center of everything. His voice carried not just confusion, but something deeper, hurt, betrayal, the realization that what he had believed to be shared might not have been exclusive. Daphne's silence answered him more than any words could. Across the room, another shift began to take shape. Deacon, who had arrived later than planned, had not expected to walk into a moment like this. The tension hit him immediately, the atmosphere charged with something that felt dangerously close to collapse. And then he saw the documents, saw the expressions, saw the way every gaze seemed to converge on him with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The truth had been exposed. Panic moved through him quickly, sharp and immediate, not just because of the revelation itself, but because of what it meant beyond the room. This was not just about Daphne, not just about Carter. This was about Sheila. Her absence did not make her irrelevant. If anything, it made her more dangerous. Deacon understood that better than anyone. He knew what she was capable of, knew how she reacted to betrayal, to secrets, to anything that suggested she was not in control. The idea that this information might reach her, that she might interpret it in her own way, twist it into her own narrative, was enough to send a surge of fear through him that he could not contain. He needed to act. He needed to contain this before it spread beyond the walls of this room, before it reached ears that would not respond with reason or restraint. His first instinct was to find Daphne, to speak to her privately, to understand how this had happened, to determine whether there was any way to manage the fallout before it escalated beyond control. But even as he moved forward, he knew that the situation had already passed the point of simple resolution. Because someone had sent that envelope. Someone had wanted this revealed. And that meant this was not just an accident of timing. It was a move. Elsewhere, the ripple effects had already begun to spread, reaching places and people who had not yet fully understood what they were about to be drawn into. Sheila felt it before she heard it, a subtle shift in Deacon's behavior, in the way he avoided certain questions, in the tension that had begun to replace his usual attempts at composure. She did not confront him immediately. She observed, watched, allowed the pattern to emerge. Suspicion, for her, was not a reaction. It was a process. And as that process unfolded, she began to sense that something significant was being hidden from her, something that would not remain concealed for long. Hope stood at the edge of it all, caught in a conflict that felt both familiar and entirely new. Her father's involvement, the revelation of the child's true paternity, the emotional devastation unfolding around her, it all collided in a way that forced her to confront a question she had avoided for too long. Where did loyalty end and truth begin? She loved her father. That was not in question. But love does not erase consequences, and it does not justify silence when silence allows harm to continue. The choice before her was not simple, not clean. It required her to weigh the cost of honesty against the cost of protection, to decide whether shielding Deacon would ultimately preserve him or destroy everything else. There was no easy answer. Back in the room, the aftermath had settled into something quieter, but no less intense. Carter no longer spoke. Daphne no longer denied. Deacon no longer attempted to explain. The truth had done what it always does. It had stripped everything down to its most essential form, leaving behind only what could not be avoided. And as the moment drew to a close, one thing became undeniably clear. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more complicated, where every secret revealed would uncover another, where every attempt to contain the damage would only expose how deep it truly ran. And somewhere, just beyond the immediate chaos, forces already in motion were preparing to turn this revelation into something even more destructive. Because in a world where truth is a weapon, the question is never whether it will be used. Only when. What followed was not the kind of silence that heals. It was the kind that cuts, that leaves everyone in the room trapped inside the echo of what has just been said, as if the truth itself has weight and has fallen directly onto their chests. No one moved at first. No one seemed capable of it. The celebration that had been so carefully prepared only minutes earlier now looked grotesque in its innocence. The flowers felt misplaced. The glasses waiting for a toast looked almost cruel. The warmth that had once filled the room had been replaced by something colder than anger, because anger at least gives people direction. This felt like collapse. Carter was still standing, but the man who had entered the gathering full of hope and certainty was already gone. In his place stood someone hollowed out by shock, by humiliation, by the unbearable realization that the future he had begun to love was built on something he had never truly understood. Daphne tried again to speak, but the words came apart almost as soon as they left her mouth. She wanted to deny, to resist, to hold on to some version of events that would make the room stop looking at her, like she had become the center of a disaster she no longer recognized. But memory had already begun its cruel work. In the space between accusation and explanation, details she had refused to examine too closely now returned with devastating clarity. A night that had once felt blurred by stress, confusion, emotional vulnerability, and too much unresolved tension now took on a more dangerous shape. The possibility that Steffi's documents were right did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through cracks Daphne had tried to keep sealed, and once it entered, her certainty began to die in full view of everyone around her. That was the most terrifying part. Not only that the truth might be real, but that some part of her had feared this truth before anyone ever said it out loud. Carter saw that fear settle across her face, and it broke something in him more completely than the DNA results ever could. A lab report was clinical. A test could be argued with, challenged, retested. But Daphne's expression was human, immediate, and devastatingly honest in ways she did not intend. He did not need her to confess anything more. He could already see the answer forming in the silence between them. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had become visible. His mind went back over every recent conversation, every moment of tenderness, every time she had placed his hand on her stomach and let him imagine himself as a father. None of those memories disappeared, but they changed instantly. What had once felt sacred now felt infected by doubt. He was not only grieving the possible loss of a child who was never his. He was grieving the version of himself that had dared to hope so completely. When he finally spoke, his voice no longer carried the warmth that had defined him earlier that day. It sounded thinner, sharper, as if each word had to cut through something inside him just to reach the air. He asked Daphne whether she had known, whether even a part of her had suspected, whether she had allowed him to stand in that room and prepare to tell the people he loved that he was becoming a father while carrying this uncertainty in silence. The question landed with more force because it was not shouted. Pain spoken quietly often leaves the deepest wound. Daphne tried to answer, but every explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. She said she had been scared. She said she had hoped the timing meant the baby was Carter's. She said she had convinced herself that uncertainty was not the same as deceit. But as she spoke, she could hear how fragile those distinctions sounded now. Fear might explain her silence, but it did not absolve it. Hope might have kept her from facing the truth, but it had also allowed another person to build his future on a lie. Steffi remained still, the envelope now lowered at her side. But the strength it had taken to come here was beginning to show in the tension across her face. She had acted because she believed the truth mattered more than comfort, but that did not mean she took any pleasure in what she had done. Watching Carter unravel, watching Daphne crumble, watching the entire emotional architecture of the room collapse under the weight of a secret someone else had deliberately sent to her, she felt the ugliness of it all more sharply than ever. This was necessary, she told herself. It had to happen. But necessity did not make it clean. It did not protect anyone from the blast radius. And as she looked at Deacon, who now stood exposed in the middle of it, another realization began to take shape. This was too calculated, too precise. The anonymous envelope, the timing, the devastating efficiency of the reveal. Someone had not only wanted